Welcome back to Truth Be Told, where we dig deep into the mysteries that mainstream science often leaves buried. Today we journey beneath the waters to uncover a lost world that challenges everything we thought we knew about our planet. Our guest is Dr. Gerald Dickens, renowned geologist, ocean explorer, and leading expert of one of the greatest modern geologic revelations, Zealandia. That's right, that isn't science fiction, it's science meeting the supernatural. Submerging beneath the Pacific lies an entire continent, hidden for over 300 million years. But the real question is, why was it buried, and what truths still lie beneath? In this episode, Dr. Dickens walks us through the shocking physical evidence recently uncovered, evidence that some believe may point to more than just tectonic shifts. Could this be a final clue in ancient legends of sunken lands like Lemuria or even Atlantis? Is Zealandia simply a forgotten continent, or is it the key to unlocking deeper, hidden mysteries, and perhaps ones deliberately erased? Buckle up, truth seekers, because we're not just talking about rocks and fault lines. We're diving into the shadowy fault lines between science, myth, and mysteries. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. Please welcome to the studios for the first time, Dr. Gerald Dickens. Oh my gosh, it's Dr. Jerry all the way from Dublin. I think that's where you're at. Is that right?
Dublin, Ireland, yes.
Yes. You know, I've never been to Ireland, and that's one of my biggest DNA percentages is Ireland. So I want to get over there one of these days. So,
Yeah, well, it's a welcoming country, so.
That's awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. We were talking right before we started the recording. Most people probably notice I'm not at my studio. Normally I'm at my studio, but I did feel like driving 2.5 hours. I mean, for Dr. Jerry, I would. But I just thought, I'll do it from home. But Zealandia, I want to talk about this lost continent. Eighth continent? Seventh continent. Yeah, eight.
Well, it depends how you the first thing is, how do you define a continent?
Well,
and then once you get around that definition, then you have to figure out, well, whether it's number 7 or number 8.
Right. Well, okay, let's start there. Zealandia. So tell us, first of all, when was this discovered? And when was the moment that you're like, wow, this could actually be another continent?
Yeah, so how to even begin? I mean, it discovered it was so always sort of there. So there was a guy named Bruce Lyondike who's not too far away from you. He's at University of, I believe it was Santa Barbara.
Oh,
and he was the first one that published this concept of Zealandia, and it sort of was out there, but not too many people paid attention to it. And his idea was that if you really map the seafloor and look at so if you strip all the water out of the ocean,
mm-hmm.
It's really obvious that there's a large block that sits much higher up that surrounds New Zealand. So you can think of New Zealand as like the little bit, not New Caledonia, or the bits that stick above the water. But most of the continent's submerged. And he said, but that didn't really hit the news until people started mapping, doing very detailed seismic work around, and said, well, this guy's totally right. What we have is, if we really think about what continents are and what defines a continent, then we've actually got a planet where you can think of, okay, what makes a continent? But the first thing you have to realize is, so ocean sort of has the world has 2 levels. You have the deep oceans, which sit down sort of on average about 4 kilometers below sea level.
Right.
And then you have land masses that sit nominally on average about 200 meters above sea level. And so like where you're living, and nobody would, say, okay, North America, it's a continent. Why? It's a block that's sitting above some baseline, but it's mostly surrounded by water, not completely, because of course it's connected to South America.
Right.
Which other people would say, okay, yeah, those two, they're almost all surrounded by water, and they're mostly sticking above sea level. But it turns out, if you go away from, let's say, South America, especially in the southern part, or North America, for example, off Alaska, there's huge area that's just a little bit underwater. And in fact, if you drop sea level, 100 meters, suddenly, Florida becomes 3 times the size that it is now because it's all shallow. And that's because it's all underlain by continental crust. So it's a particular type of rock material. And that's why the continents stick up high. And the ocean is mostly floored by basalt. Totally different composition. It's much thinner. And so you have thin areas that are most of the ocean, certainly the deep parts. And the continents are sticking up. And sea level is going up and down, through time. Mm-hmm. And so the size and dimensions of the continents are partly constrained. Our view currently is just where the water sits. And so you can imagine if you build up a bunch of ice, pull the water away, huge areas, Florida gets much, much larger.
Right.
And so it's just, that. So that's sort of the background to this. And it turns out if you drop the water quite a bit, then Zealandia appears as this big continent. So it's a relatively large area, and it just happens to be mostly underwater. Whereas like North America, the continent itself right now, it's something like, 80% is above water, of which we can draw the boundaries. But then you have areas, so for example, off Florida, which are slightly underwater right now, but it's still the continent. Does that make sense? Or?
That makes sense to me. And I hope anybody that's listening to the podcast, audio or video, please, leave some comments. We'd love to hear if you don't understand, we'd love to, get that a little more understanding for you.
Yes, it all has to do with the thickness of what we call the crust, the bit on the outer bit of Earth, and the composition. And so you can think of continents as thick material made out of continental crust, and the oceans are made of thin crust that's made out of a different composition, basalt or oceanic crust. And so it's this idea where you have the reason we have oceans and continents in the first place really has to do with sort of the outer shell of Earth and its thickness and its composition. And then we just flood the holes with water. And that's the way we think of the surface now.
Let me ask you this about plate tectonics, because a lot of people kind of goes over their head, and we don't feel the movement except through earthquakes and other things. Most people may not even realize that. But how does Zealandia, help us kind of understand this plate tectonics, especially in terms of how continents can sink and become part, or can break apart over, millions of years?
Wow. Okay. So the very first thing is to realize that plates are not the same as continents or oceans. And so you've got oceans and continents, which are defined on the thickness, as I just mentioned, the thickness and the composition of the material. The plates are defined where we've got mostly rigid shells on the surface of the Earth that are moving in time. And you've got 3 different sort of boundaries between plates. You've got areas where one plate is sinking under another, a phenomenon we call subduction. So one plate is subducting under another. Then we've got where 2 plates are converging. So they're diverging. So that the 2 plates are pulling apart and new materials coming up from below. And then we have parts where they're sliding side by side. And a very good example is, let's say in California today, where you have the North American plate is on one side, it's on the east side. The Pacific plate is on the west side with a little bit of a continental crust where you're living.
Right.
And you've got, most of the US and Canada are on the North American plate, and they're sliding side by side. And so relative to that, you have this motion where one plate's sliding past. And so then we get earthquakes because we've got these 2, rigid, quasi-rigid bodies sliding past each other, where you have one plate going under another one. So, for example, let's say in the Gulf of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, you have the Pacific plate now going under the North American plate there. And then as it melts, it comes back and you form islands made out of volcanoes. So you have a volcanic chain. So volcanoes are a great example in most places of where one plate is subducting under another. excluding some odd bits like Hawaii, but that's a different.
Right. It's a whole different subject. Well, I don't want to get too far off the subject, but I do want to touch on the volcanic. I don't know. I'm sure your expertise on this, but there's been a lot of talk in Alaska and even a volcano off the coast, I believe, of Oregon, I believe, that they said that possibly could erupt. Is this showing that the plates are more active at this time?
Well, see that. I mean, the plates. The plates are always active. They're always moving relative to each other, and so it's the boundaries between the plates where the action is. So if you're out in the middle of the plate, it's sort of dull because that's not where you don't have, there's no motion of rigid bodies. You can think of it as like, cars or something. So two cars, if they can, if they're just moving together, it's great. But if they touch and they're going in opposite directions, okay, now we got a problem. If one hits and goes under the other one, we've got a problem. If they're going away, well, then that's sort of divergence. But you can see why we've got these areas. So the volcanoes, we're always having volcanoes. We've had volcanoes, for billions of years, and they just go off now and then. And each one of these, volcanoes, you have to build up some magma over time, and then eventually they go off. Same thing with earthquakes. And so where you get earthquakes is when you have two plates and they sort of get stuck for a while, but the plates keep on moving. So eventually they sort of, it jumps, and then that's your earthquake. But as you're building up the strain as these two plates are moving side by side. Now, if we go to Zealandia, it's sort of interesting because we have this continent of Zealandia. If we remove all the water, it sits on two different plates, and so part of it sits on the Australian plate, and part of it sits on the Pacific plate, and the two are moving side by side through the middle of Zealandia, and that's this big fault system that goes right through the north end of the South Island and into the North Island, and and so
is this part of the Ring of Fire?
And so a lot of this relates to the Ring of Fire. So, for example, the Pacific Plate, all around, let's say all the way from, if we go from, it's volcanoes all along the South America, the west side of South America, and that comes all the way up through Central America, beautiful volcanoes. And then it peters out when it hits to California, because now the one plate isn't going on another. They're now going side by side. And then when you get up to Oregon, northernmost California, like Mount Lassen, and then and north all the way in through the Cascades, again, you got volcanoes because now you have a plate going under the North American plate. And then that keeps on going around Alaska. All that's volcanoes as you go along. And then, coming down through Japan and all the islands, all the way down to New Zealand. And so that's sort of the start of the Ring of Fire. Are the volcanoes in New Zealand.
I want to talk about Expedition 371.
Yeah.
Your team drilled into the floor of the ocean floor to extract some sediments of core, and I was curious, was you ever surprised or find anything unexpected during these core findings?
Oh yeah, I mean that's the beautiful thing about going to areas that are unexplored. It's
right.
Like whatever you find, it's new. Yeah, and so we've lots of different things. Like right off the top of my head, and we still don't know why it works. Is we drilled down in one site and we found a whole bunch of copper.
Oh wow,
that's really unusual in a deep sea setting. We don't really understand it. No one's really worked. Not a lot, but enough that it was obvious that you had native copper in there. That's just one of these things that we haven't even started working on because it's just sort of bizarre. But other things like the main reason we went out there is to test. So Zealandia used to be connected to Australia and Antarctica, and then you had this process of rifting. So as we started moving the Pacific plate away from Australia. And so, yeah, it's a little bit complicated there. It started moving apart and then it got sutured. So it sort of stopped. And what we know when it sort of stopped, and it was around 53 or so, 52 million years ago. And why that becomes interesting is what happened is the whole Pacific plate rotated at that time. So you usually think of plates sort of moving in one direction, and the whole Pacific plate made sort of like a 45-degree turn. And there's all sorts of evidence, but what happened there is it stopped this spreading of Zealandia away from Australia and Antarctica, and then it sort of shoved Zealandia up above the water, and so that and then it sank, and then so we were trying to figure out the exact timing. So we predicted it was going to be about 52 million years, and then when we drilled it, yeah, that absolutely nailed that. So we know how the sort of process of sort of pulling two continents apart, stopping it, and then pushing a continent up probably about 2 kilometers in the air, I should say into the air, and then it sank back. And so now it's, nominally at the average depth is about 1 kilometer below sea level, but it was above sea level for a while. And now
How long do you think that was?
Probably less than 10 million years was it exposed. And so what you could do, and when we drilled the sites, one of the fascinating finds is you go down and you find areas where you're missing sediment because it's being eroded. And then right on top of it, it has shallow marine organisms. And then it just gets deeper and deeper into all the fossils in there. And then eventually you're in sort of deep, fossils that only accumulate in deep water. Because they're sort of raining down from the surface. And yeah, you see that in the cores, this whole process of sort of popping up New Zealand when the Pacific plate rotates.
And what's the size of this, do you feel?
How big Zealandia is?
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Yeah, it's probably, just top of my head, it's it'd be about the size of Australia, the continent Australia. Yeah, so
it
was yeah. So I mean, it's or on par with the U.S. And so it's but you can see today. So if you look on a map, you'll see the 2 big islands of New Zealand, and then just off the top of my head, something like 1,500 kilometers north, you'll find the island of New Caledonia. And those are the parts of New Zealandia that stick above the water. But they're connected underwater by relatively shallow. And so the nice way to figure out Zealandia is you just look at a map where you remove the water, and you just see what we call the bathymetry of the ocean, or the depth of things in the ocean. And then Zealandia becomes really obvious. You're like, oh, there's a big patch of Earth's surface that sits way above the average depth in the ocean. And close to the depth of the average depth of continents, it's just a little bit below, though. And so it's covered with water right now.
And I'm going to throw this out there because, this is Truth Be Told, and we talk about all kinds of paranormal, conspiracy, and even, sometimes fantasy. But, we've talked many times about Atlantis, the lost continent of Atlantis. Do you feel like this? 23 million years ago, more than likely, there was no humans at that time. But do you feel that there was some type of life on this continent?
Well, so this is where things get really cool. I believe in evolution and all sorts of things about life. So you can imagine, so we had this overall continent called Gondwana.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that, and slowly you can think of Gondwana was really large if we go back, 180, 200 million years ago. So a long, long time ago, back in dinosaur ages, early dinosaur age. And then that its little pieces started, not little, but, it started fragmenting. And part of the fragmentation, was India broke off.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had Africa break away. And then you sort of had this smaller bit that was Antarctica, Australia, and Zealandia. And so those three were still connected, as well as South America. Sort of, you got to think of from a pole view. And so it's connected to Antarctica, but separate from the part with Australia and Zealandia. But they're still making this single continent. And then what happens is Zealandia breaks off it starts about 83 million years, breaks away from the other two, from Antarctica and Australia. And it starts separating until this Pacific plate rotation about 53 million years ago. And then, but you can imagine, so it separates, but it's carrying all of the fauna and the flora from Gondwana, and it moves along, and now it's quite a ways away.
Right.
And then everything changes, and most of it goes underwater, but we know that it can't have all gone underwater. And then when it fully pops up, and so if we go to New Caledonia, for example, today, we see forests that are sort of the original forests that were around in the dinosaur age, and they were preserved, and they're totally unique. And so the flora there is absolutely different than Australia, and it's completely different than anything in the northern hemisphere.
Wow.
So and so absolutely things were living there.
Right. No, that's amazing.
Yeah, and so if you look at carefully at the at pictures of New Caledonia, you're like, okay, something looks a little wrong, and you realize that the trees are just fundamentally different. And so, yeah.
Are they taller, or are they? What's the difference?
They're all a species called Araucasia, of which an example would be the monkey puzzle tree, if you know that. That's a Gondwana. So go back, 150 million years. There weren't very many pine trees.
Right.
But there were all these Araucasia, and then eventually the pine trees were, sort of developed on the northern latitudes, and they've displaced these Araucasia, and so they're limited to places, for example, the monkey puzzle tree in southern Chile, because it was still part of Gondwana. And then you go to, New Caledonia. Well, another one's the Norfolk pine, if you've seen. Mm-hmm. And they look sort of like pine trees at first, but then you realize, no, there's something funny about them. And what would
you say about me?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you look at them, what happens is all the branches come off the trunk at the same level. And so that's completely different than something like, a pine tree or a fir tree, where the branches are all coming out, as you know, from like Christmas time. Right. But they're all scattered along the trunk. And so, yeah.
I'm just more my curious mind. Have they tried to transplant these trees into like Australia, and do they?
You probably got. I'm sure somebody's got some in California. I mean, they.
I'm just curious if they took okay. I mean, if they,
Yeah, and so like not a lot of the New Zealand ones aren't, but I mean certainly monkey puzzle trees. I know you've seen that. They're really bizarre looking. I mean you'll see them planted around. I know they've got some, for example, in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco.
That's great.
So
well, I want to ask you when it comes to technology. Nowadays with AI and pretty much anything you can think of with technology from 20, 30 years ago, how has that played a role in, the discovery and understanding Zealandia a little bit more?
Yeah, wow. And so it turns out, like on these drill ships, a lot of the technology, it's gotten better, but it's still a bit stuck in time.
Really?
Yeah. So so certainly the scientific ocean drilling began in sort of the late 60s, and there's been a lot of I guess how do I explain it? The actual technology to collect the cores and the way to do that has not radically changed, although there's some technological breakthroughs that have made the collection and the quality of the coring much better, and there's been some advances in that. In other words, if you go back, we can still work on cores that were collected, 45, 50 years ago. And yeah, there's some problems because back then most of the drilling was rotating the cores, and so it takes some of the cores, especially in soft sediment, and sort of mixes it all up, and so it's not very good. But what we've developed is new tools to put on the end of the coring. So now what you do is you essentially, instead of just rotating right in,
Right.
you build up a bunch of pressure and it's like shooting a straw and you can do that for, in some cases, with the latest pieces. You get it down to a couple 100 meters below the seafloor if you're lucky, and right through the sediment. Yeah, and that changes everything because then you can see all the details and the layering.
That must be really cool, though. I mean, the excitement of just pulling up a core and just to see if you find something that you've never seen before. That must be an exciting feeling.
Oh yeah, it's great when you're out there. I mean,
I bet
you look out and many of the places we go drilling, for these scientific cruises, you can't see any land, and so. Well, you can see really clearly when you're out in the middle of the ocean. You can see that the ocean's curved. I mean, the surface. So you're wondering, like, how did people think the world was flat? When you on top of the drill rig, you're like, it's clearly curved. And especially you get a drone these days. So we didn't have drones out there until maybe 10 years ago. Now you're out there and you can get these drone photos. You can see your little ship, and all you see is water as far as the eye can see, but it's clearly on a curved surface. And so
that's amazing. Yeah. Well, I know it's must have inspired other people, other researchers of not, doing the drilling, or maybe drilling, but of trying to find, like I said, this has been far enough back, but there are people that believe the world is, humanity's been here a long time, but has it inspired other researchers to trying to find, lost civilizations, or have you worked with other researchers on this? That's something that may not be your expertise.
Well, I mean, I work with people all around the world. I mean, it's one of the really nice things about being an oceanographer is, I mean, right now I'm working with some Japanese. I'm working with people in Italy. Wow. I'm still working with people in New Zealand. And so lots of people around the world. It's a really nice international community. Although I do have to make a funny comment I'll share with you in a little bit, though. No, but what we do is look for things like, essentially the way it works, or what it has until recently. People just have really interesting ideas, and they say, okay, the only way we can solve this problem is to go out there and drill the seafloor. And you can think of the seafloor as, the modern seafloor is time zero. Okay. And as you start going down, it's like a time recorder, and it's recording everything at that location. As you go deeper and deeper, it's just getting older and older. And of course it depends, but in some cases you might drill and you go down 100 meters and then there's a gap in time, time is missing. For example, in Zealandia, when it popped up above the ocean, then it was being eroded and then it drops back down. So there's a gap. And you're missing, in some cases, you can be missing millions of years.
Well, how do you explain that?
Well, think if you're collecting a bunch of sediment underwater, right? And you take your bit of, your seafloor, and you raise it up above the surface. Now you have rain and everything else, and it's eroding it.
Okay.
And then you drop it back. You drop it back under the ocean, and now you start to accumulate it on top. But now you're missing the time, and that time tells you how long it was above the sea. But there's other ways to do it. So, for example, in some places, if you start developing very strong bottom currents, they can scour things. There's lots of different ways that you can just have what we call a hiatus, and you're missing time. But in some cases, you can go down. Part of the problem too is that you can imagine if you're accumulating at a fast rate, you can't. I mean, if you want to go back, 15 million years in certain locations, you got to drill down several kilometers, and in other places, it's very, very, very slow sedimentation. and you might go down back, 50 million years in 100 meters. But that's really slow sedimentation. And so, yeah.
That's pretty.
And then, of
pretty
course, the location's moving in time because of plate tectonics. But
yes, that probably doesn't help too when it comes to. I'm glad you probably know what you're doing, because I'm sure the plate tectonics, sometimes the movement may kind of dilute some of the core. I don't know, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, you can imagine what can happen is, let's say, if let's say in the middle of the ocean, most of the material that's raining down to the seafloor comes from the surface water. Little organisms that are, phytoplankton and zooplankton. They're making their little shells, and then it rains down to the seafloor, and so we get this, just constant rain. But that total rain depends on how productive the waters are. And it turns out, like, the middle of, let's say, the Pacific Ocean at 30 degrees latitude is really dead. It's like it's a desert. It's the same latitude as deserts, and that whole idea of, and it has to do with, the way fluids circulate on the surface of the earth. And so you have places, as Southern California is not exactly a green place, because it's getting close to that 30-degree magic barrier where you have much greater evaporation than precipitation, and that extends out into the ocean. And so if you went directly west and a little bit south of Los Angeles, you get to effectively a desert in the ocean. So if let's say you take a site and it's out there in the desert today, below that, then through plate tectonics, you start, as the Pacific plate's moving, you eventually move out of the desert. And so you can be coring, you could have an interval that's, it's accumulating very, very slowly.
Right.
And then suddenly it just, it looks like things are blossoming. And that's a really crude example of how you can get a major change in sedimentation, just as plate tectonics is moving that site from a zone of evaporation and precipitation. And those zones don't really change through time because they have to do with the spin of the earth, not plate tectonics. And so, yeah, but it becomes fascinating as you figure out how all these things work in the time to make.
Well, I just have a few more questions. And one, I mean, it's very topical because with now the glaciers are melting, a lot of polar ice caps, and Antarctica. How does that affect Zealandia with, more water coming into the oceans? Does it?
Yeah, I mean, so gosh, yeah, this one's, and it's wow, what in fact we could go for a day time.
We probably should have Zach on that one,
because much of our information about climate change and how the world works actually comes from looking at the ocean sediment, not on land.
Yeah.
And certainly over longer time frames. Anything. Let's say we go back more than 10,000 years. Most of our information is coming from ocean sediments, and, well, to some degree ice cores, at least for the last sort of 500,000 years or so.
Right.
And so, yeah, and what that this whole field, paleoceanography, of just how to understand how the oceans and climate change work in the time domain. And so what we know, at least over the last sort of let's say 500,000 years or so, we have these ice sheets going back and forth. Well, in fact, they go back much longer, but let's just focus on the last 500,000 years. So about 20,000 years ago, we had big ice sheets, over Canada,
right.
Go back all the way, Midwest, and that dropped sea level, and that drop in sea level was about 120 meters. And so Zealandia right now, the highest, most of the submerged part. So once we get away from New Zealand in New Caledonia, the average depth is sort of sitting around 1,000 meters. So those places we don't, it's not like it's going to be exposed as sea level goes up and down out there and over most of Zealandia. But we do see the effects of that. And we see things like, for example, if we take the drill cores, we see oscillations. So if we go back 20,000 years, we see changes in just the shells. We see changes in the sedimentation rate. And those go back and forth. And that occurs in all sorts of places in the ocean where we see that effect in the time domain. It's almost ubiquitous in the ocean. So we can, and so all of these places are, and then what you do is what we try, you think of like, how do we make any sort of predictions on climate change? And,
I'm sure
we can take all these cores and you can start making predictions. Okay, at this site, this should have happened if this model explains things. And that's been done lots and lots of times over the last, increasingly. And it's really fascinating. So you can actually predict now. You can go to one of these drill sites and say, this is what we should find based on all our knowledge. And a lot of that times it's correct. And so it's,
Wow. Yeah, that's always going to be a big topic. I know for at least for a generation or two until we kind of see what's going to happen next. But and
I wanted to show one thing is just that all of this ocean drilling and everything, it's a strange thing. And so the U.S. has just dropped out of the whole business. So for 50 years, the U.S. ran ocean drilling.
Wow.
And was really the leader of everything, and sort of brought Europe, Japan, all these other countries into the fold, and then it became a big international program. And literally last year, the U.S. just said, "Nope, we're not going to fund this anymore." Wow. So right now, the only places that are funding it are Japan and Europe at sort of this limited program. And then you'll never guess what has just happened in the last year. So some other country on the planet decided, hey, it's our time to build like the best, most up-to-date, technologically advanced drill ship and go out there and start chasing it. And you'll never guess which countries decided to do this.
Well, I have an idea, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. China's just built and launched.
That's what I was going to say.
Like something that we've never seen in the U.S. It's like suddenly it's like the U.S. suddenly running space, and then suddenly the Chinese come along and say, hey, we can do that better than you. And we're going to start building rockets, and we'll send the first person to Mars or whatever. And it's amazing that, I'm sort of stunned because, being an American, but living in Europe for a while, just to see this from the outside and just go, wow, like,
we used to be the leader on everything.
You don't want to be the scientific leader, so let alone other things. And
yeah, whoa! I remember. I wasn't born when JFK said, going to the moon, but that's still, that's part of our history of trying to be the leaders. So hopefully that will change.
Yeah, it's strange because you'd think like with the current administration, somebody would just point out, and instead of justifying it on any, the science, which is really cool, just say, hey, well, if you don't want to fund this, hey, your little neighbor's going to do a much better job than you.
Right.
You think you'd get irked, and then suddenly it'd all be funded again.
Amen. Well, Zealandia, lost continent. From what you've seen, what other potential lost continents are out there for the people that are interested in continents that are no longer with us?
Well, okay, if we went to the say this is where, at the very beginning I mentioned, how are you going to define a continent?
Right.
You think of a continent as some large block of material that's made out of continental crust that's mostly separated from everything else. So it's not a definition of where, like the water is or the land is. And so if that's your definition of a continent, that it's built on continental crust and it's large, there are no other ones, because we know what the seafloor we know the seafloor has now been very well mapped. And the only large block that sits above everything else is Zealandia. All the others are blocks where most of it's above water, and so we already know what they are, but as I mentioned, like parts of, something about 20% of North America lies underwater right now. So one of the odd ones. So right now they're drilling off the coast of Massachusetts. A rare thing where the National Science Foundation linked up with Europe. So you have Europe's Europe is now drilling off Massachusetts, but with some co-funding from the U.S. So the U.S. has gone into this mode of, well, we don't have a drill ship, and our program's sort of shot, but we can sort of buy a little bit into the European Japanese program. And so that's happening right now on the continent, but it's underwater, but it's very shallow water, sort of 1,500 meters deep. And that's interesting because what they're trying to look at is, you can imagine when you do have a lot of ice on land, so 20,000 years ago, that was all land. Because, the water from the ocean goes into the ice as the sea level drops. And so what it does is if you have aquifers, so sandy units out there, they get filled up with fresh water. And then what happens, the ice melts and then sea level goes up, but the aquifer's still there. And so they're drilling into these freshwater lenses to try to understand how they actually work. And so there's and we know that these lenses, they occur all along the east coast of the U.S., in this, because the East Coast has a much broader, what we call continental shelf area. And a lot of that continental shelf has these sort of brackish, meaning not seawater, but, towards freshwater, these lenses that stick out, but we don't really know how they work. And so, so there's,
I'm glad you're explaining all of this to us, because I'm sure there's some people that, like I said, there's things about oceanography that I wish I knew more about, and it's nice to have you on to talk about this. But my last question is, looking ahead, what's next for Zealandia research, and is there a follow-up expedition planned?
Well, as I mentioned, so it'd be hard to go do a cruise right now unless we get the Chinese involved. But there are a lot of times we'll do one of these cruises to understand a fundamental problem, scientific problem. In this case, to understand, how did this continent, break away from Australia, sink down, pop back up, sink back down, and to understand the history of that through time, and whether that was all linked into, sort of the rotation of the Pacific Plate, and I should say the start of the Ring of Fire, because right now the Pacific Plate is subducting under all these areas, like, Japan,
Right.
The whole western part of the Pacific Ocean is all lined with volcanoes. That whole process started at 53 million years. Before that, none of that existed, because Pacific Plate was moving north rather than northwest. And so that rotation from a almost straight north direction to a northwest, suddenly all these islands and all these subduction zones, all these volcanoes, they all formed along and essentially the start of the Ring of Fire. So, but that's all been figured out now, sort of. I think, as I mentioned before we got on the show, is sort of, it was really exciting, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we were, coming off the cruise and all this was coming out, and the whole definition of Zealandia and showing how it all worked. And everyone's sort of like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's sort of like, well, there's no more controversy, because it's all sort of solved. So the next big jump in that sort of research would be that, we come along with another outstanding problem. But then, even if we did have that, then the problem would be, like, we need a drill ship, because, the one that we used last time was the U.S. drill ship that's now decommissioned. And so,
wow. Well, let's get some money your way. That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
So,
but if people are really fascinated about that, you can go on to something called the IODP website. Well, it's now called IODP Cubed, so IODP 3. And you can see the proposals. They show all the proposals. I think there's about 25 in the system. So these are things that people from all around the world, people, effectively being forced, they have to be sort of with a strong science background, mostly, researchers and professors. And you can see what people want to go drill, if we had a ship, if the funds were available. And there's some really cool projects, to understand, like, how most of it's to understand just how the world works.
Yeah, no, this is great. And that's one reason I started Earthly Beings Foundation. It's like I was telling you, lost cultures, lost continents, lost traditions from the ancient times. And, maybe we'll have to start doing some fundraisers. We need to raise the money to get your research back going. But, I think we'll just say that to get the controversy going again, that the Anunnaki is the one that raised it and dropped it again. So. There we go. It's back on. It's in its paper again. But Dr. Jerry, thank you so much for doing this. I had a great time.
I'll send you like a little PowerPoint thing on it. And you can put that. I'm happy if you will put it on your website and people they can look at that.
And if anybody out there wants to, if anybody out there wants to, reach out to you, maybe have some questions on their own, can they just throw you a couple questions or two?
Yeah, it's just I'm just
He's a busy man.
That I get like 100 emails a day. So.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, and so if anyone sends me an obscure one, please don't take it as offensive if I accidentally grabbed it as spam or something, or if I didn't get to it.
And for the flat earthers, don't take offense.
Well, it's anyone who believes in the flat earth. I just say, get up there, on top of a mast of a tall sailing ship. It's you just hold your hand out and you can say, oh, hey, it's not flat.
It's not flat.
It's
all right. Well, thank you, sir. And appreciate you. Stay on real quick because we got to finish this up. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And really, it's Dr. Gerald Dickens. And he's in what school are you at again? The
Trinity College, Dublin.
So hey, if you guys want to go into oceanography, maybe he'll be one of your professors in Dublin. But thank you all for tuning in on Truth Be Told every Friday. We'll see you next time. We'll talk to you soon.